Hello, everyone. I'll let you just get into the platform, get into Teams. There's been a little bit of a queue of you in the waiting room. Thank you very much for your patience until we got to the point of starting today's event. Okay, so look, hello and welcome, everyone. Many thanks for joining us here in Brisbane, although we actually have one of our panel members who's joining us from northern New South Wales, Tenterfield. So thanks for joining us from Brisbane or wherever you are in the world, and also whether you're watching this event live or watching this as a recording. My name's Brian McIntosh. I'm the Education Director at the International WaterCentre and Associate Professor of Integrated Water Management here at Griffith University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I meet you, the Yuggera-Bull, Yuggera, Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. If you're joining us from somewhere in Australia, please make sure that you acknowledge the traditional owners of the land whose country you meet us from, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Indigenous Australians are the longest continuous living culture in the world, and we have much to learn alongside with and from Indigenous Australians about stewardship of land and water and of the country on which we live. So water security is it's one of the most significant concerns here in Australia. We're coming out of yet another multi-year drought into a La Nina summer with a wet forecast, and that's great. You know, my mother-in-law is going to be particularly happy about her garden, but it's just 1 year. Oscillations between wet and dry periods are characteristic of the climate of much of the eastern seaboard of Australia, where Brisbane is located, where I am just now and where we are mostly. But these oscillations are underpinned by a trend, an increasingly drying landscape, to decreasing rainfall, increasing temperature and increasing evapotranspiration. And the terrible bushfires that swept across our landscapes during the spring and summer of 2019 and 2020 were really a direct consequence of this trend. The Eastern experience, or the Eastern Australian experience, is not unique, however. Across the world, we're seeing changing rainfall patterns and increasing land and ocean temperatures as a context in which human population growth and demand for water continues to rise, which means that water security is under pressure almost everywhere. Water security is partly about reliability of quantities for supply, but it's not just about quantity for supply. It's also about quality of water, it's about cost, it's about accessibility, it's about the timings of rainfall and river flows, it's about ecosystem function and services, it's about catchments, and it's also about a broad range of social, economic, spiritual and cultural values that depend upon water in some way. So to help us today to think through and explore these varied dimensions of water security and the challenges involved in achieving it or them, we've assembled a deliberately diverse panel of speakers from across research and practice. And I'll go through and introduce the speakers to you just now. So we've got, first of all, Dr. Lachlan Guthrie. If we could make Lachlan live. Dr. Lachlan Guthrie, not Lachlan Guthrie, is the WASH and IWM project manager at IWC. And he's been working with the Asian Development Bank recently to measure and assess different dimensions of water supply security across Asia. Lachlan's also an alumnus of our Water Leadership Programme. And then secondly, we've got Emma O'Neill, if we can make Emma live. Emma is, there we go. Emma is the programme lead for climate change adaptation with SEQ Water, which is the bulk water supplier for South East Queensland. And she's been working intensively on incorporating climate change into regional water supply security planning. Emma is also an alumnus of our Water Leadership Programme. Next, we've got Andrea Salos, if we can make Andrea live. Andrea recently graduated from our Master of Integrated Water Management programme and has joined Sunwater as a water planning officer. Sunwater is the bulk water supplier for much of Queensland outside of the southeast corner. Andrea completed her master's degree with a thesis focused on better understanding how to design agricultural water supply products in terms of their cost and reliability. Fourth, we've got Professor David Hamilton. We can make David live. David, you can wave hello to everyone, David. Excellent. David's the Deputy Director of the Australian Rivers Institute here at Griffith University. He works on the restoration of lakes and freshwater ecosystems more broadly, both in terms of research and the provision of policy advice. And beyond that, also works on improving catchment resilience as a mechanism for achieving water security. And finally, we've got Tanya Kirkegaard. Tanya is a big and bold woman and the Acting Executive Officer of the Northern Basin Aboriginal Nations, or NBAN. NBAN is a not-for-profit company, and it's the peak body that represents, advocates for and empowers First Nations in water management in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. Tanya is currently studying our Master of Integrated Water Management on a part-time basis. So we'll hear from each of the panelists in turn over the next 40 minutes or so, with some questions designed to tease out their different perspectives on the challenge before us, achieving water security in a changing world. We'll then shift into a more organic format, asking some common questions to the panelists and also posing some of the questions that you type into the chat box to them. So please do feel free to type your questions in. We'll then move on to learning a little about the range of professional learning solutions that the IWC offers, enrolled through Griffith University, to help you play a more active role in achieving water security, before we conclude by taking the temperature of our panelists about the temperature of their views on our collective ability to achieve water security in this changing world of ours. We'll see how pessimistic or optimistic they feel. So thanks again for joining us as we now move to our first panelist. So Lachlan, welcome Lachlan, and thank you for your time today. Perhaps we could make Lachlan live. So Lachlan, I'd like you to tell us, and tell the audience if you can, about your experience in developing and using indicators to measure and assess water security as part of the ADB's Asian Water Development Outlook. Based on this experience, what would you say are the key challenges that we face in planning to achieve water supply security across the Asia-Pacific region, and how might we address them?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brian. Yeah, so as Brian mentioned, I've been doing a fair bit of work with the Asian Development Bank, looking at the Asian Water Development Outlook. The acronym that I'm going to use quite a bit in the next couple of minutes is ADO. Yeah, so one of the really great things about ADO is it doesn't look at water security as just quantity. And so, as Brian quite rightly pointed out, there are temporal, spatial, affordability and accessibility elements that we really need to consider in a holistic assessment of water security. And we also need to look at future water-related risks. So one of the things about the ADO framework is it separates different users, or water security for different users, looking at households, the economy and the environment separately, and assessing water security for each of those users, and then developing recommendations and identifying the challenges there. So for water security, essentially it's about the right amount of water of the right quality in the right place at the right time and at the right cost. So all 5 of those elements are really crucial if you're going to look at holistic water security. So for an example, and I'm sure others will talk about this a lot more, but yearly variability is incredibly important in environmental flows. I used to live in Cambodia, which is dependent on floods for one season, and then it has a lot less rain in the next season. So aggregating the water quantity over a year really isn't relevant for the Mekong Basin. Then also households, you really need to consider the specific requirements. So water needs to be available pretty much 24/7 of a really high quality and available at the household. And for water security of households, we need to expand it to include sanitation and hygiene, which are often forgotten about when we talk about water security. I think that if you were to say that, oh, they have a good water supply, but they're still, have chronic diarrhea because of poor sanitation, they're not in a water secure situation. And then looking, it also needs to be forward looking. So for example, where we might not be in a drought right now, but Australia has very high risk of drought, and looking forward, there might be increased risk of flood. So those are very, very important elements of a holistic water security assessment. So then moving into your second part of the question, Brian, the challenges. So different challenges are really, they're very contextually specific, different for every country, and different for, between cities, between basins, even in countries. So what one of the really good things about ADO is it allows you to sort of have broad brush common theme recommendations, which is what I'll talk about now. But if you do go and have a look at the ADO document, which will be released shortly, you're able to quickly drill into specific countries, specific problems, and learn a lot more about that and the contextual elements that you'll find. So, of course, the biggest change that anyone in water is facing is climate change, and I think that goes without saying. I'm sure Emma's going to discuss that more, so I won't harp on it about it too much. But absolutely, #1 biggest challenge. Then so the second challenge that we came across developing ADO is there's a really large lack of data. So I'm sure we've all heard the saying, you can't control what you don't measure. And so for some countries, we don't know what their water security situation is like, and that's really quite worrying. Thirdly, there's a huge lack of human resources throughout the Asia Pacific. This isn't something that we're probably experiencing so much in Australia, but in a lot of developing environments, there's a huge lack of human resources. What we're seeing is that water and sanitation planning, generally the policies are pretty good, but they're falling down on the implementation side due to lack of resources. Another common challenge was rethinking storage. So for economic water security and for disaster resilience, it's really important to have big dams, but they can have really poor impacts on your environment, which I'm sure David will discuss a bit more. So the final challenge, the final cross-cutting challenge, is inclusiveness. So the SDGs talk about water and sanitation for all, and what's seen in many countries, in every country, there's a huge disconnect between the water and sanitation access in the richest versus the poorest, and so we really need to work on working with those vulnerable communities and lifting them up in their access. Yeah, thanks, Brian.
No, that's great. Thanks, Lachlan. Just one before we move on to Emma. One quick question then about I suppose diversity. So you painted a picture there of context specificity. Every country is different in terms of water security challenges. Every river basin, every city. What does that mean in terms of how we might build up collective knowledge to tackle water security?
That's a very interesting and very difficult question to answer. So while every basin and every country is unique in the challenges that they face, there are significant similarities between many countries. So what we were sort of able to see is, problems 3 and 4 might be present here, and problems 2 and 3 might be present here. So those two countries really should be getting together and talking about problem 3 in that example. So there is an enormous amount of knowledge that is transferable across countries, and further to that point, there are many, particularly in Asia, there are many international rivers, and to ensure that those international rivers are protected, you really need to deal with every country along the line. and that's the best way to move forward, as I see it.
Okay. Thank you, Lachlan. And you've raised the challenge of climate change, which I would agree is perhaps one of the, if not one of the biggest challenges that we all face, regardless of which city or country we're in. But I'll take that as a theme and pivot towards our second panelist, Emma. So Emma O'Neill works with SEQ Water, and particularly with respect to climate change. So Emma, SEQ Water has been working hard to assess and plan for regional water supply security here in South East Queensland, where we've got population growth and operating alongside the impacts of climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about this work that you've been doing and SEQ Water have been doing, and the challenges that you can see climate change presents for water supply security here in South East Queensland and perhaps beyond? And in your answer, perhaps it would be great to see, get a sense as to whether you see those challenges as operating over the short or the medium and the long time scales, and some of the best options that you think we have for meeting them, responding to them.
Excellent. Thank you for the question, Brian. I'd just like to also acknowledge traditional owners of the land of South East Queensland, where I do my work as well, and also I think with an international audience, acknowledge the role of Indigenous people globally for their contribution to water management too, just before I start. So as you've mentioned, Brian, SEQ Water is the bulk water provider for the broader South East Queensland region, and we source, store and treat water that's then distributed to communities serving over 3 million people. So our water supply is largely dependent on sourcing water from catchments and then storing it in dams, but we also have some groundwater as well as options to manufacture water through either desalination or recycled water. So my role is looking broadly at what climate change means for our business and developing and implementing a program of work that's helping us to then respond appropriately. So in terms of timescales, climate change is already happening. It's going to continue to get worse, and that's even with substantial emissions reductions. So sorry for the bad news, the dose of realism. So according to NASA, I was just looking this up earlier, 2019 was 1.15 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial average. And the Paris Agreement that we're committed to achieve is seeking to limit warming to well below 2 degrees to avoid catastrophic climate change. However, the current efforts have us on track for more like 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So that's a bit of context around the type of change we need to think about when we're looking at adaptation planning. And closer to home, the Bureau of Meteorology records show that winters in Brisbane are noticeably hotter and longer, and winters are shorter and warmer than they were last century. So we've already seen this impacting our catchments. We have catchments that were burned in the bushfires last year that we're now monitoring to make sure that when it rains, we're not overwhelming treatment plants with ash flows. We're also starting to see increasing evaporation losses from our dams, so which means dams can drop more quickly than we might have planned for, at the same time that we might be seeing demand spiking. And the climate change projections are showing that these changes are going to continue throughout the century, even with significant emissions reductions. So we're going to need to adapt to further changes in climate beyond what we've already seen. So with this in mind, our climate change adaptation at SEQ Water has a number of different focuses, deliberately looking quite broadly across our business to try and understand at a systems level what climate change means so that we can respond in the best way possible. So we're looking at asset vulnerability. So things like understanding whether any of our treatment plants and water supply infrastructure is likely to become increasingly exposed to climate hazards, to natural hazards. So we know sea level rise and storm tides are projected to impact the coast. And we also have indications around flooding increasing in magnitude or frequency, same with bushfires. So all of these things may either damage our infrastructure or disrupt supply. So we really need to have a handle on where those vulnerabilities are within our system. We're also looking at the current and the projected changes to the water cycle due to climate change. And we're accessing the most up-to-date climate change projections, looking at temperature, evaporation and rainfall changes, and then starting to embed them into some of our long-term planning, like our water security program, which helps us to determine when we might need a new water source. And we're also thinking about thinking through some decisions about how do we best use our current infrastructure to supply water in a changing climate given the existing asset base. So for example, the sorts of things we're thinking about are, we have manufactured water infrastructure already constructed with the Gold Coast desalination plant and the Western Corridor recycled water scheme, but using these to supply water is a more expensive option, and using water from these sources results in significant greenhouse gas emissions due to our energy consumption. Meanwhile, we have dams, which provide a less expensive source of water, but we have to question whether we can rely on them being full when we need them to be, as the rainfall patterns are changing. And we're also starting to understand more about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with dams and reservoirs, which are harder to mitigate than those that come from electricity consumption. So we've got a number of different things in the research space as well. You mentioned before considerations around water quality, and we're recognising that climate change is likely to reduce water quality with things like increasing turbidity in algal blooms, likely as temperatures rise and rainfall intensity increases. And we need to understand that so that we can build that into our treatment capability planning, as well as think about how we can try and work in our catchments to build resilience. And we're also in the process of working with other partners, either across the water industry and with the Queensland Government and with local councils as well, to share information around adaptation and how it's impacting our different assets, and how we're going about using scenarios for future planning. So I guess in summary, I think we have a lot of work to do in order to adapt the bulk water supply for climate change, but it's essential that we do this work so that we can continue to provide a safe, secure and cost-effective water supply into the future as the climate continues to change.
No, thank you, Anna. And you're right that doing nothing is not an option. I suppose just a quick follow-up question then around, I suppose, in a sense, uncertainty. You're dealing with here. You're looking into the future. You're trying to deal with so many changing dimensions. How are you coping with? How is SEQ Water wrestling with just the complexity and the uncertainty here?
It's I mean, you're right. We are dealing with future scenarios, and what we've done for our water security program is to develop a range of future climate change scenarios based on our understanding of the likelihood and plausibility of future events occurring, and we're then using those to test different options against. So looking at both a high and a more mid-range emission scenario to see how that might play out in terms of impacts on the water supply.
Okay. So look, we'll return, I think, probably at several points, I'd imagine, to this theme of complexity, and also I think you mentioned resilience, which is another theme I'm pretty sure we'll pick up as we go along. So thank you for just now, Emma, and we'll pivot over onto our third panelist, Andrea Salas. So Andrea, you recently graduated from our Masters of IWM, having completed your thesis project on, in my words, water allocation product design for agriculture in Queensland, and you're now working for Sunwater in water planning for bulk, I think largely agricultural water supply. From that research, could you tell us what you see as being the key challenges faced by bulk water suppliers in providing adequate water security to agricultural producers, and faced perhaps by the producers themselves in terms of balancing cost and reliability of their water supplies? Oh, we can't hear you. It looks like
sorry about that.
No, you're all right.
I got it.
There we go.
I'm trying to keep myself on mute. Yes, thank you, Brian. Definitely got into a little bit of this with my thesis and got to see both sides of kind of both sides of the table, which was nice because some of the challenges are similar, but definitely a bit different for each group. In terms of the challenges faced by the bulk water suppliers, there are kind of 3 areas that I was going to highlight. I think one of the biggest is just managing the infrastructure, and that's kind of 2 things. One is aging infrastructure and regulated pricing. A lot of the infrastructure that are owned by the suppliers is quite there's not too many new projects, and so there's upgrades that are needed and things that get damaged due to floods, and figuring out who pays to keep that up so that we can continue to supply the water is kind of a bigger challenge. Is it the users who are kind of getting the direct benefit, or the government, since there's a wider community benefit in terms of producing food or supplying materials? And so, yeah, keeping the infrastructure up to be able to supply. Similarly related is dealing with supplying the water through the infrastructure in times of drought. One of the things that I didn't really think about too much before was there can be a little bit of water in the dam, but you might not be able to access it easily, or if there's no water in the river, to send the water from the dam downstream. Figuring out in those times how to make the most of the infrastructure and actually still be able to supply water. So that's kind of one aspect. The second area that I got into a lot more with my thesis was the changing demand and availability patterns, which Lachlan kind of mentioned, and Emma as well. And part of that is related to climate change, not knowing what's going to happen and how that might change the demand or availability patterns. And then partially that is because there's quite a trend in crop changing, and a lot of that's gone from annual crops towards perennial crops, whether that's trees or nuts. And then, so when you switch from an annual crop to a perennial crop, that changes the demand needs and also patterns. These perennial crops tend to need a lot more consistent water, and a lot of the systems kind of connect back to infrastructure weren't built for more of these annual crops and their irrigation patterns. And so from the supplier side, figuring out how to continue to provide water in this new way is a bit of something that's needing to be considered a lot more. And then kind of still with the climate change and changing demand patterns, there's figuring out, with the uncertainty of what will happen in the future, how to plan for it and what to do with any reserves that are in the system. And one of the things we talked about recently with the DNMRE is some of the systems do have reserves, and people are going to want to buy that water for changing their crops or creating more cropland. But should that be set aside for potential need as the climate changes? And so trying to look forward and decide how to manage that water, and if some needs to be set aside, it's kind of an interesting challenge and something that they're starting to think about. And then kind of the last area that I'd highlight from the supplier side is lack of knowledge, and also the challenge of communication between the supplier and the user. And this isn't probably just something that is kind of on the bulk supplier, but that the government is involved with as well. But one of the biggest things that I found when I was working through my thesis is there often is quite a big disconnect, even with the very savvy farmers, between where exactly the water comes from, how their allocations are calculated, when something needs to be done to the infrastructure, why is it being done? And so that gap kind of is a bit of a challenge in terms of keeping the relationship going and making sure that everyone is working in there and supplying and using the water in the best way possible. And part of that is communication and making sure that everyone is on the same page and figuring out how to convey the information and what information needs to be shared. So that's kind of from the supplier side. And then in terms of the users, which in Queensland, it's a lot of mining or gas, and then a lot of agriculture especially. And so they share the challenge of knowledge, being able to find out all of the correct information that they need to make their decisions, and making sure that they know what they need to know. And I think that in addition to that, it's looking and trying to make forward-thinking decisions, which is a challenge shared by the bulk water suppliers in a different way. For the users, it's, do we spend money on water now at the current price and maybe have it as backup in case we need it later, or in case there's a dry year, or do we save some money and continue to expand? What's the price point in which buying more high security water becomes, what's the price point that becomes viable? And in order to kind of make those decisions, they need to be able to both think long term and also have the information that enables them to kind of make those decisions, which can be a bit of a challenge as we're still trying to create that information. And so that's kind of what I would say is the challenge of both sides. A little bit of shared, and then obviously a few things that are more significant to each of the users and the suppliers.
No, that's fantastic, Andrea. Giving us some insight, I think, there into tension between a couple of different dimensions. Reserves, having more reserves perhaps means more infrastructure, more cost. And as Lachlan mentioned early on, one of the dimensions of water security is affordability. So yeah, very interesting. That's a bit of tension and trade-off there, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Look, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our fourth speaker, but we will return to this. I think the issues that you've raised there, Andrea, particularly because agriculture, mining, and so forth are such big water users. When we get into the more organic questions. So our fourth panel member is David Hamilton. David's the Deputy Director of the Australian Rivers Institute, or ARI. So David, the staff of ARI have been working hard for many years to understand environmental and ecological dimensions of water security, both in terms of how water impacts environmental and ecological processes, but also importantly, how restoring those processes can offer ways to improve water security at catchment or river basin scale. What I'd like to ask you is, what do you see as being the key environmental challenges and opportunities with regards to achieving water security, both here and globally, perhaps with that sort of a catchment thinking in mind?
Well, thanks, Brian. And I want to begin firstly with the opportunity. As you mentioned, I'm in the Australian Rivers Institute in the university system. And what that means is that I've got an opportunity to influence and to be influenced by the next generation of water security scientists. So in that regard, I can see some emerging opportunities that may probably enable us to bring about the sort of step changes that are needed in water security and the challenges it faces around rapidly changing land use and, as we've heard, climate change. One of these is around the geospatial or spatially distributed data. We've now got the capability to generate soil maps, land use maps, elevation maps, and many other properties on a catchment at resolutions from meters to, in some cases, global. So one of the questions that's arising is, what do we do with all of this data and how do we best use it? So I think a primary role for us is to be able to predict. And we do that in order that we can improve our preparedness and our ability to adapt to the future. So models, whether they be AI or statistical or process-based, have several really valuable perspectives. Firstly, they can bring about a data interrogation process, which looks at the quality and consistency of the data sets that we're collecting. Secondly, we can learn as we process these data sets. And thirdly, we use the data to make predictions. So we've really got a rich opportunity with a rich resource of our emerging young cohorts, fluent in data analytics and modelling, to be able to bring about the step change. At the same time, I sort of burrow into the data advances. I'm also identifying the need for graduates who are comfortable working in the socio-ecological, socio-economic context and also in diverse cultural contexts. So increasingly, and especially in the area of water security, we're faced with complex questions that bridge disciplines and involve networks of data and people and ecosystems. And so hence why I put an emphasis not just on the detail of some of the data sets that are available to us, but also on these networks of people and of information. Another project I want to talk about briefly is around catchment resilience. And water security here is going to require a very careful consideration about how we balance grey and green infrastructure. So the grey infrastructure, such as water and wastewater treatment plants, can vary widely in efficiency, we know that, but in some cases the better operations are reaching their technological limits for improvements. So additional efficiency gains in infrastructure are going to become more difficult, and investing in key areas, sometimes in the top of the catchment where much of the sediment and nutrients are actually generated, can be really important as to how we optimise our investment as we approach the technological limits of some of the grey infrastructure. So in other words, not all diffuse pollution is the same, and if we're able to accurately target these hotspots where contaminants are generated, then this is what green infrastructure is about. So enabling these well-targeted investments that are efficient, bring about catchment scale effects that reduce flooding, reduce erosion, and reduce the loss of productive soils across the landscape, then this is really going to be the key. And it's this combination of balancing grey, green and blue infrastructure that is going to be so important.
David, can I just briefly interrupt you there? Maybe in case people who are listening don't really understand the green infrastructure, could you give an example or two of what that might look like?
Well, the green infrastructure is about things like you would have heard of nature-based solutions, and it's really about working with nature in order to be able to bring about the sort of changes in catchments that I'm talking about. So whether that be the use of wetlands, enhancing natural wetlands, or using constructed wetlands, it may be going and planting or replanting riparian areas, and it can be revegetating the tops of hill slopes where much of the erosion occurs. So that's to an extent what the green infrastructure is about, which also has associated with it green jobs. And what we need is to be able to efficiently target those investments. Where are the problems? What are the hotspots? And what are the contaminants that we're looking to control? The last thing I want to talk about is the what's called a water security CRC, and this is a new initiative that we've got. The CRC is a cooperative research centre, so these CRCs are used in Australia as large research centres aligned to provide industry relevant research. And the 4 areas of the water security CRC that we've identified are in combination with stakeholders, safe and integrated water supplies. So here the emphasis is on our ability to integrate across the water cycle to enable better planning, take advantage of improved digital systems for water management, and to also safeguard against emerging contaminants. The second component is maximising the investment in green and grey and blue infrastructure, and improving the governance around these investments. The third aspect is around livability. Water is critical to support our way of living, our health, the benefits that we derive through having available clean water and sanitation. And so the livability element is another key component of the water security CRC. And the last aspect is about engaging communities. What are the processes and tools that we can use to be able to co-plan, co-design, and use co-governance to benefit and have a community-led perspective to water security? So thanks, Brian, and I'll hand back to you.
No, thank you, David. You've picked up on that theme of catchment resilience, which has come up across a couple of times so far. Look, what I'll do is I'm going to hand over to and introduce our fifth final panelist, Tanya Kirkegaard from the Northern Basin Aboriginal Nations. And Tanya, you've been working on the ground in Aboriginal land and water management here in Australia for many years, and have recently taken up the position of Executive Officer of NBAN, which is one of the key stakeholding organisations within the Murray-Darling Basin, which is one of our largest basins here in Australia, if not the largest basin. The basin's under significant and growing water stress and insecurity, which must be presenting a range of challenges for Aboriginal cultural use of water. Can you tell our audience, which is diverse and from here in Australia, but also from around the world, what cultural uses of water are, and what the key challenges presented to them are over the sort of short and long term as a consequence of growing water insecurity, and how might some of these be tackled?
Thanks, Brian. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the sovereign First Nations of Australia, and in particular the Murray-Darling Basin, and the land on which I live and work in Toowoomba, and including my own Bigambul people. I honour our ancestors and pay respects to our elders past and present, for they hold the memories and traditions of our continued cultural and spiritual relationship to our land, seas and waters. And I encourage our future leaders to walk with dignity, pride and respect, and recognise their valuable and unique contributions to society as they carry our hopes, desires and dreams in their hearts, in their minds and in their successes. So I've been working within land and water in the Murray-Darling Basin for the past 8 years, and it has been very challenging and rewarding at the same time. Cultural use of water is a complex, holistic and spiritual application of our traditional law and customs. And it can't be defined, I guess, as any one thing, but it encompasses the tangible and intangible connections to natural ecosystems and the web of life that those ecosystems support. So for Aboriginal people, water is life. And for most First Nations groups, water law is actually women's law and land is men's law. So they must work together to support one another to ensure continuity of species. They're not just human, obviously, but all flora and fauna as well. It's a cultural responsibility that First Nations people have, and an accountability, both in a natural sense and a physical sense, to keep those laws of nature in balance so that all life can flourish. The challenges can't be done, I guess, or explained in silo. It was a way of life and that holistic approach. So the dispossession of lands and that disconnection from country and the decimation of the ability to practice those laws and customs on country have led to, I guess, a lot of the disadvantage and the disparity that a lot of Aboriginal communities experience. I guess also that a lot of the cultural use of water has sort of more been now recognised along the lines of hunting and fishing and swimming. It was the basis or the heart for our social interactions and connectedness with one another. So I guess the way that water is now managed is completely foreign to the way that First Nations people managed water. And of course, the way that First Nations people lived was that they lived day to day. They only took what they needed. They never took more than they needed. And so how water is managed can sometimes be very overwhelming and very hard to even understand or comprehend for First Nations people. NBAN has been functioning as a rep body for First Nations people in the Northern Basin for 10 years. It represents, I think, 21 First Nations groups. And of course, the Northern Basin is particularly vulnerable because that's where the headwaters of the Murray-Darling Basin is. And that's where a lot of the floodplains are, and that's where there's been a lot of growth in industry and that sort of stuff. So First Nations people haven't always been afforded a voice with regards to water management and water delivery. That is slowly changing, and there's been a lot of projects and a lot of reform that has been including that First Nations voice, and that's something that NBAN advocates to do for the nations in the Northern Basin. Lack of access to water, as I said, with that disconnection of land or that dispossession of land, and I guess the lack of water entitlement and water ownership that's been identified as a current challenge for First Nations people in relation particularly to economic development and advancement is something that First Nations people haven't had the privilege to be a part of. That hopefully too is changing. So with the short-term and the long-term challenges, short-term, yes, we are now being heard. Yes, we are being included in the conversations. Our cultural values and uses are being included in water resource plans, in water sharing plans, in floodplain management, all that sort of thing. So ensuring that there are flows to meet the needs of those values and uses, that I guess things are being shared more equally within those river systems and those different valleys, is a promising concept, I guess. How we actually ensure that, you know, there is water security, because that's not something that First Nations people had to even think about. And we had a cultural responsibility to ensure whatever water flows through our country was going to flow onto our neighbouring countries, and provide them with the same level of support and nourishment and continued life as it does for us. So that web of life and that interconnectedness was something that was just a part of our everyday life and not something that we were ever challenged by, I guess. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword sometimes for First Nations people who work in water management. Technically, we have to make a lot more sacrifice than anybody else. And I guess it comes down to that understanding of the wider community and water managers and all that sort of thing with the relationship that First Nations people have with water. I mean, for us, water is spirit. That's where our creation spirits lie, and it feeds into everything else. So it affects, you know, ceremony. It affects fishing and hunting and swimming, our bush tucker, our bush medicine. It's where a lot of our knowledge transfer happens. The rivers are basically the schools for our kids, and you know, there's also then the spiritual and physical and social and emotional health and well-being that was reliant upon the health of the rivers and waterways. Therefore, you know, we feel that the success and growth and social and emotional health and well-being of our communities that the rivers and waterways support is a direct correlation. So if the rivers are unhealthy and they're not flowing and everything's not green and healthy, well then the communities that those waterways support also won't be. So I guess moving forward in all of that, until environment is considered over and above industry and economic development, First Nations people will suffer the challenge of applying their cultural responsibility, as was administered by traditional law. And unfortunately, it's the wider community in the entire nation or the entire Murray-Darling Basin that suffers because of that. integrating that knowledge and finding some sort of common ground around how we can manage and deliver that water will certainly affect our level of security moving into the future.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. You've painted a rich picture of connectedness there between people and landscape and water, and also I think quite a strong call for collaboration. I knew that water was women's business, but I hadn't really thought of land as men's business, and land and water must work together. And look, I think there's a very strong message in there around water security, in a sense, perhaps created because of the way in which we've chopped up water into various responsibilities. Those responsibilities do need to coordinate, collaborate, and work together to reconnect the system in some sort of a way, particularly if we're going to meet the ongoing and increasing challenges of climate change. So look, we've had a few questions in from the audience. So I'm going to pose a few of those to the panel. So the first one is from somebody anonymous, which is fine, unless that may actually be their name, in which case, hello, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. They've asked, I suppose, a question. It's more of a statement, but they said, look, we need public awareness about water scarcity and using every drop of water wisely. I guess in the cultural context, Tanya, in the environmental context, David, in the water supply context, Emma and Andrea, we can interpret this comment as a question. To what extent is a lack of public awareness a problem? Is this something that we ought to be focusing on collectively? Who would like to go first? Stick up your hand. Oh, Tanya's not stuck up her hand, but she has. Oh no, David's done it. He's stuck up his hand. Excellent. Go for it, David.
I'll have a quick go, Brian, at that question. I think that one of the things that we do have is much better visualization tools for some of the work that's done, and those visualization tools now need to be used across the different domains to bring people together, and whether that be Indigenous people, whether it be stakeholders, other stakeholders with who have property, government, and also managers, in a way that can constructively use those tools to be able to visualize the future. Yeah. Okay. So better understanding, using visualization tools to better inform the public, perhaps about water distribution and futures. Yeah, absolutely. And Tanya, Will, because you didn't raise your hand, but you made a cough, which is almost like raising your hand. So in the context of cultural flows, look, I'm not sure if this is exactly true, but I think the public is maybe beginning to vaguely get to grips with the idea of environmental flows. To what extent do you think cultural flows is really the idea is out there? Is it a useful idea? Is this something important to try to get, I suppose, the public engaged with improving water security holistically, and perhaps for cultural purposes?
Yeah, I guess Cultural Flows is a project that's been initiated to ensure that there is water available for specific cultural needs, which also includes economic, rather not environmental or to do with culture. So environmental water has been around for quite a while. And there is actually a First Nations environmental water environment project that is including cultural values and uses to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office, I guess, to advise levels of flows and that sort of thing, and to meet cultural targets as well as environmental targets for the wider community. So there's a bit of an overlap between cultural flows and environmental flows. But if targets can be met with environmental water, that's even better, but cultural flows are specifically for cultural totems. Yeah, so there hasn't been any cultural flows as yet. That's still something that's being developed, and of course with what's currently available in the system, there isn't any water available. There is currently though floodplain harvesting licenses and hopefully being implemented next year that will actually hopefully save some water for the environment, well, not necessarily just for the environment, but in the system. But yeah, so environmental flows is really encouraging. The research there is enough water to meet environmental flow objectives and outcomes, and some of those cultural uses and values are being met by those environmental flows. There are separate flows as well, hopefully in the future for specific cultural outcomes and objectives as well. Okay.
Thank you, Tanya. We've had a couple of questions. I'll move off of that question around raising public awareness. We've had a couple of questions, one from Matthew Ampong and one from Joby Manga. So Matthew asked if water security is addressed differently at country level. How do countries deal with trans-border water security? And Joby Manga has asked to the river basins, dam catchments are sometimes situated in more than one country. Are there any examples of countries who effectively implement agreements as far as protecting and sharing of water resources with equity? So some questions here about water security as in a transboundary context, and that even applies, I think, inside Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin. We have our own internal transboundary issue across the states, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and so forth. So who would like to tackle this issue of what does water security mean across countries, and how on earth is that to be managed? Okay, panelists.
Brian, I'll fill the space for the moment.
Excellent.
and just say that is a really great question. And we have some huge challenges globally coming up. You know, the Nile River, with so many countries dependent on it, being heavily utilised upstream now, with many water plans upstream, and real concern about, you know, just what's going to be left at the sort of bottom of the catchment. The Mekong is obviously another very topical one. And when you think about even within country, you know, you've already mentioned Australia with the Murray-Darling Basin. Colorado River is another example where there's huge and increasing pressures on the upstream part to cope with increasing population and demand for water. I wish I could pose an answer to you. I can't pose an answer, but it's going to have to require an enormous amount of collaboration to actually avoid conflict.
Okay, thank you.
I can jump in and add something here, Brian, just a little bit. I had done some research a little bit with the Jordan River, and it seemed like some of the grassroots work that was being done to kind of bridge the gap in that scenario was a way that they were starting to bring a bit of collaboration together, because even, sometimes it's hard to get the big governments to agree, but it seemed like getting people together at the more ground level, and then they were able to make some noise and work on some projects together, and that seemed like it was a good place to be starting in that regard. But then it requires kind of leaders from all of those areas to be stepping up and wanting to sort of bridge those divides.
Yep, sure. Thank you, Andrea. We're going to ask one more of these questions, which I think will be perhaps pointed a little bit more towards our bulk water supplier colleagues. So Peter Rooks has asked, how does current local and state government action on water security policy and infrastructure solutions compare with modelled climate change scenarios? Is there a deficit between risks identified and actions taken? And if so, what can be done to best tackle this disconnect? Maybe Emma, will hand over to you.
I'll start to give it a little bit of a crack, and thank you Peter for the question. I think there are a number of requirements that are starting to come in at state government and local government level, where climate change is starting to be a consideration in decision making. I know that in the water security planning guidelines for South East Queensland now, there's a requirement for the first time for us to consider changes in the climate as part of our scenario assessment. And I understand a lot of local government have been including increased rainfall intensity into their flood mapping for floodplain management at a local council level. So I think there are probably we're starting to see some of this coming in, and then that analysis is then informing risks and decision making. I think we've still got a fair way to go, but I'm starting to see some signs that we're making progress in that space.
Okay, thank you. And there's actually quite a lot of questions coming in, and they're fantastic. We're not going to get to answer them all. I do apologise for that. We'll maybe do just one more. Where was here we go. Yeah, so Callan Riley, and I'll make this an open question, although Lachlan, you've been conspicuously absent in responding. So are the panelists seeing any exciting or effective methods or collaborations emerging to help assess IWM responses and inform decisions for investment, given the numerous complexities and variables that need to be considered, especially when many of these considerations are less tangible or hard to place an accepted value on, for example, social or ecological?
Yeah, Brian, if I could have a first crack at that.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so Callan, as you very rightly point out, and as David said before, a lot of these issues are very complex, and it's a balancing act between integrating the impacts from one form of water security and that might have negative impacts on another area. So integration across all types of sectors is really quite important. So when you asked that question, I immediately thought of some of the work that Brian's actually doing in Afghanistan, running a master's program there, and really building the capacity of those practitioners to be able to think integratedly and expand and make sure that the impacts that they're having are holistic and well thought through. So to me, that's a really exciting move forward. There's also other work. Sorry, this is turning into a plug for IWC, but there's other work that IWC is doing in the Pacific, looking to create a Pacific WaterCentre, and again expanding the integrated water practitioners in that region. I think those kind of things are really exciting for me.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Lachlan. Look, David, did you have you look like you might have an additional comment before we close? No, that's okay if you don't. That's all right.
Well, I guess I was just going to say that a lot of it revolves around the value of water and its value for cultural, for social amenities, and the environment, for the food that's produced, and being able to truly value that is a really, we've got to push that, I think, harder, because that value aspect is so multifaceted that we really need some tools to tease out the whole of the value of water.
Yep. No, thank you. And look, David, I think the partly what perhaps underpins or could underpin a greater appreciation of the multiple values of water is of course a shift in attitudes and a building of capacity. So what I'm going to do is just briefly veer away from the panel towards highlighting some of the ways in which you might engage in learning to develop the kinds of skills and knowledge which might help derive changes in the way that we manage water holistically and in a coordinated manner to improve water security. So I'm going to share my screen. So the International WaterCentre and Griffith University have a range of different professional and postgraduate learning opportunities which are available and which have been designed to help build different aspects of skill and knowledge base capability so that you're able to play a more active role in achieving water security. We've got a couple of master's programs which I'll briefly talk about. One of them is our Catchment Science Suite, which is a master's, a graduate diploma, and a graduate certificate. Taking up, I suppose, David's mention of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, we designed a Catchment Science master's program really to develop a kind of a different kind of professional. It's quite clear from conversations that we've had with many different stakeholders from industry and government that we are too siloed and specialised in the way that we approach restoring and managing catchments. The engineers are very good at the hydraulics and the engineering, but don't know enough about the natural science. The natural sciences don't know enough about the engineering and computing and economics and the valuation of intangible components of our landscapes and our water is missing again from this kind of skills equation. And so we developed the Master of Catchment Science as a way of building a different kind of catchment professional, a specialist, so a quantitative specialist able to play a leading but interdisciplinary technical role in planning projects, programs, policies and infrastructures to restore, to protect and to manage catchments for the purpose perhaps of improving water security, which may be for supply purposes, maybe for environmental purposes. And you can find out a little bit more about that master's program at the URL there. We also have a Master of Integrated Water Management, which is, I suppose, less specialised than the Master of Catchment Science. It's deliberately a broadening Masters, and so we talk about the IWM as the Masters of IWM as being a program that helps develop T-shaped professionals. So the idea of the I is the specialism, so you know a lot about a little, and then we broaden specialists out to with a range of different additional skills and knowledge bases to be able to play a more effective role in working with others to manage the whole of this complex water cycle. And we do that through a wide range of different professionally oriented applied courses from project management and social impact assessment through different aspects of collaborative planning and governance, some of the water quality science, treatment and hydrology, and then into economics, water sanitation and hygiene, community development, a whole range of different subjects which cover really the whole of our river basins and catchments. And the cities and communities, ecologies and food production systems that lie within them. Both of our master's programs, I guess, in a sense, build the organising and the understanding component, which leaves that influencing box on the right-hand side of the T-shaped diagram a little bit unaddressed. We address that influencing box because achieving water security, particularly in this changing world, is about responding, it's about adapting, it's about being able to do things differently, do new things, introduce new policies, projects, plans, infrastructures, ways of working, shifting attitudes. All of these are linked by the idea of change, and change happens as a consequence of people working together. Change happens as a consequence of influence, of groups of people working together to influence practice and direction. And so we build those skills through a couple of products, a non-award program, the Water Leadership Program, and then a for-award qualification, the Graduate Certificate in Water Leadership. And each of these programs for next year, because of course we're in a coronavirus challenged world, will be available in flexible digital and blended modes, so that we're still able to build the capacity and capability development that we see as being central to achieving water security, despite some of the restrictions on movement which are present globally and even within Australia just now. Although, touch wood, that will be changing over the coming months. So, thank you for listening to a little bit about the International WaterCentre and how we are seeking to play a role in this adaptation process, as we each seek to play a role in achieving water security, whether it's for water supply purposes, whether it's for environmental purposes or cultural purposes, or even economic purposes. What I'd like to do then is turn back to our panelists just now and ask a question. Take their temperature effectively. So panel members, and we'll go around, I guess, the order of presentation. So we'll start with Lachlan, and then go to Emma, Andrea, Tanya, and David. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 represents a high degree of pessimism, and 10 represents a high degree of optimism, how do you assess our chances of being able to achieve water security in this changing world of ours? Audience members, what do you think? How do you rate our chances from 1, very low, to 10, very high, and why? Lachlan, over to you first of all.
So I'd say probably about a 6 out of 10 in terms of optimism. The reason for that is we are really faced by some massive challenges, but I'm quite optimistic in the innovative nature of humans, and particularly the youth throughout the Asia Pacific, and I think that we will be able to get through them. And so that's why I'm more optimistic than pessimistic.
Excellent. And I just want to check, where you're using the full scale there, up to 10? You weren't limiting yourself to 6?
No, yeah, up to 10. So 6 out of 10.
Okay. And Emma, the same question to you, from 1 to 10, and why?
Okay. I'm scoring this a 9. I have to retain optimism that we will face the challenges that are ahead of us, and I think that we absolutely can do it, despite the fact that with climate change coming, they'll be substantial. But I also think that we're not going to do it applying 20th century thinking, and we're going to need new thinking, dedication, improved diversity of thought, and if we do that and we dedicate our efforts in the right way, then I'm very optimistic that we can do it. Excellent.
I like your optimism, Emma. Okay, so Andrea, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you evaluate our chances and why?
So I was thinking about this, and I will probably rate us on our current trajectory a bit more on the pessimistic side. I was thinking 5 out of 10, because it really seems like we are not unaware of the problems, but kind of as Emma said, current thinking and the ways that we're taking action aren't really putting us on a trajectory to create the really big change that needs to happen. I'm not pessimistic that it's impossible, and I do think that if we are able to start making those bigger changes, that we will be able to create this resilience. But on our current path, we're not really moving on that trajectory, and I think we got to draw the line between we can do it, but are we actually doing it right now? So current trajectory, middling optimism, but I do think it's a possibility that we can really start moving in the right direction.
Okay, no, that's good. It's a call for a paradigm change or a step change. Business as usual will not work. So no, that's a good point to end on there, Andrea. And David, are you as equally optimistic as your New Zealand colleague, or are you different from 1 to 10, and why?
I'd have to go an 8.5 then, wouldn't I, Brian? To beat Emma. I am cautiously optimistic, but I'm concerned about the losses along the way, and one of those, you know, we can't have another Cape Town type situation. We have to also be very cognizant of the Pacific Islands and the challenges that they're facing with sea level rise. And we also have some major environmental challenges now as climate change intensifies, and that's around biodiversity and the benefits that water brings to that. And so, you know, we don't want to be counting the casualties. We want to be counting the successes as we cope with these.
Excellent. Okay. Cautiously optimistic at 8.5. I'd hate to see you'd be positively exuberant if you were just moderately optimistic. Okay, and Tanya, so from 1 to 10, how optimistic are you and why?
I'm normally quite an optimistic person, not very pessimistic, but have to be a realist in this kind of a situation as well. As much as we are aware of our current situation and the things that need to happen to get us somewhere along the lines of ensuring our future where water is concerned, I don't think enough is being done at our present time, and I think it's going to take a long time for any of those changes to really be implemented and for any of the outcomes or the rewards of those measures that can be implemented see fruition of. So I'm going to stick with a 6. There's certainly a lot of things that need to be considered around water security. There's a whole range of impacts that have led us to where we are, and there's certainly a lot of redress that needs to happen to get us to somewhere that is actually sustainable and to sustain the growth that, you know, that we're looking at in the coming years. So yeah, 6 for me.
Okay, so that's a sober but still on the positive side response. And where would I rate myself? I think I would. I think I would probably be up towards the 8 side, and partly what makes me go towards the upper side of optimism is character. I'm a bit psychotically optimistic, but is also the interactions that I have with young water professionals, particularly, encourages me that we're not creating or we're not seeing a generation of people coming through that are just going to do the same old thing, the business as usual. They're not going to accept the business as usual, and so I hope that they are effective in their calls for change. And if you are in a position of authority in an organization and listening to this, it's your job to enable those young professionals to create the spaces into which they may grow and challenge the business as usual, to enable them to experiment, to pilot, and to try new approaches. That's your job, and I hope you respond to it well. So look, we'll draw this event to a close. Very many thanks to you all who engaged live. Thank you if you posted a question. Thank you, and apologies if you posted a question and we didn't manage to answer it. But also thank you for your time if you're watching this recorded. Again, your engagement is much appreciated. If you've got any questions, an email will be sent out after this event, which will include a contact email address. And whilst it will look a little bit like a generic email address, it will be attended to by a real person who will quite quickly get it on to whether it's me or even one of the panelists, if you've got a particular point to follow up on. That's our commitment to you. So I'll also then finally thank our panelists. Maybe we can briefly put the camera on them. So thank you, Lachlan, for your time. If you can wave everyone goodbye once the camera is on.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lachlan. Thank you, Emma O'Neill. Once the camera is on, you can say
thanks for attending, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea Salos.
Thank you.
Thank you, David Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Brian. Yep, and thank you, audience.
And finally, thank you, Tanya Kirkegaard.
Thanks, everybody. It's been interesting. Thanks.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the man behind the scenes as well, Damien Harris, who you haven't seen, but he's been operating the mechanics. So thank you. And that's us finished for today. Goodbye.